Good morning and welcome. I'm Kristen Rupert, Senior Vice President for External Affairs at AIM and also Executive Director of the AIM International Business Council. And I want to welcome you all this morning to our Trade Talk, Beyond Supply Chains, Forging Ahead in Global Business. Supply chains are still in the news and very much in the news. In fact, I just saw something pop up on my news feed this morning that said, oh, it's the same problem that we had at the start of COVID with the closing of ports, et cetera, something about China. So we will, of course, be covering supply chain issues today. There are also other issues facing companies doing international business, and those include inflation, the impact of the war in Ukraine, high prices for raw materials, port closures and backups, and more. So we'll be hearing more about these and other issues as we go through today's session. First of all, I just want to review a few housekeeping items. We will not be doing a live Q&A during this webinar. However, you can submit questions online via the question pane. And what you need to do is in that pane, you type your question in and then you click send. And finally, if you have any technical issues during the presentation, please email my colleague, Catherine O'Reilly at C-O'Reilly, so that's C-O-R-E-I-L-L-Y at aimnet.org. And then you should be all set. One additional note, a special thank you to our sponsors, New Balance and Santander Bank. We could not present programs of this type without their support. So we are grateful. Thank you, New Balance and Santander. So now let's get started and meet our panelists, all of whom are from AIM member companies. Duncan Scott is Senior VP for Strategic Sourcing at New Balance. He's been with the company for 12 years. He's lived and worked in Latin America and Asia. And previous to New Balance, he worked for Adidas and Reebok. Duncan was on the track and cross country team while an undergraduate at Cornell University, and he's a lifelong athletic footwear aficionado. New Balance has its global headquarters in Boston and manufactures shoes in Massachusetts and Maine, as well as overseas. Welcome, Duncan. Lisa Wieland is CEO of the Massachusetts Port Authority. She oversees multiple operations for Massport, Logan Airport, Worcester Airport, Hanscom Airport, Conley Terminal, the Boston Cruise Terminal, and all of Massport's real estate operations, including an extensive seafood processing community and the new Omni Hotel, all of which are in the Seaport District of Boston. Lisa became CEO of Massport 3 years ago after serving as port director for 5 years and serving in other senior roles at Massport for 12 years. Earlier in her career, Lisa worked for Bain & Company, a global consulting firm. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Kristen, for having me.
Of course. And finally, we have Eric Aberbach, Senior Vice President for Global Trade and Working Capital at Santander Bank. He recently returned to Santander as a commercial lender, having worked briefly at the bank 9 years ago. For the past 7 years, Eric was a lender at JP Morgan Chase. And prior to that, he was with TD Bank. He's had a long career as an international banker and now provides loans and lines of credit and other products primarily to middle market clients. Welcome, Eric.
Thank you.
So now we're going to move on to our discussion. So a little bit of background. AIM has been doing a monthly confidence index, business confidence index, for about 30 years. And we send out a monthly survey and we measure company executives' sentiments about the economy, the local economy, the state economy, the national economy, and businesses' sentiments about their own companies. And by and large, companies are pretty optimistic about what's going on. That being said, we did have about 50 companies weigh in last month when we asked about supply chain issues. And we had, again, more than 50 companies who said they were struggling with supply chain issues. And when asked about how they're dealing with supply chain issues and how they are mitigating these problems, the most common responses from these executives were order more, order earlier. 2 respondents actually said they were hoarding. So that was kind of an interesting response. And add new suppliers at home and overseas, deepen relationships, and be patient. So just to repeat that, order earlier, order more, add new suppliers, deepen relationships, and be patient. So I think that's a good backdrop to what we're going to be talking about this morning. So now we're going to hear from our panelists. Again, reminder, if you have any questions, please type those into the question pane. That's for the audience, not the panelists. So we're going to start with Duncan. Duncan, you deal daily with supply chains across the world. So you have a great view of supply chain challenges and opportunities. Can you give us a brief summary of where we are today with supply chains, given what's happened for the past 2 years?
Sure. Thank you, Kristen, and also thank you for the opportunity to address the panel today and the team today. It's nice to be a part of that. So I think everyone has been reading the papers. You can see the effects of COVID on the supply chain, and most of us experience that. It may be a trip to the grocery store where you're noticing that some of the shelves are a little bit less stocked than they normally are, or maybe it takes a little bit longer to order something, you receive something that you ordered on Amazon. So we've been experiencing that. It really started when COVID started in China. We had a what I would call a modest supply chain problem where supply was constrained. And then shortly after that, we started to see the major markets of Europe and North America really shutting down. Retail was shutting down. There was no demand. There was no cash flow. I'm sure Eric can speak to that. So if the brands weren't getting paid, they couldn't really start buying a lot more products. So that disrupted the flow of orders to our supply partners, our factories. So then after that, you started to see markets recover. And then all of a sudden you had a whiplash effect, but you also simultaneously had some of the big supply countries in Asia, notably China, Vietnam, Indonesia, countries like that, really having their own struggles with COVID. And in particular, they were having difficulty getting vaccines at that time. So they were a lot more cautious. There were a lot more social restrictions put in place. And that led to a major supply problem. So all that kind of whiplash back and forth of supply and demand issues really sort of created havoc in the logistics world. And what started to happen was there was a backlog. Inventories were low globally, again, in the major markets. So if you think about Asia supplying to Europe and to North America, but also even local supply chains, all of a sudden there were big equipment shortages. And the way logistics works is everything has to flow, right? If you have an airplane, it has to be in the air, and then it has to land somewhere, and then it's getting ready to go its next destination. If it's delayed in one area, it's going to create problems all the way down the line. So it's quite complex. So this big surge in demand coupled with low inventory levels, it's not something that's going to go away in a few months. It basically took sort of 6 months or a year and a half to get where we are. But now you have sort of very big chronic problems, which are going to take not months, but likely a few years to completely settle down. So again, some of that is things like a shortage of container ships. Container ships take quite a while to build. So you build these contracts, it could take several years. So what is likely to happen is if you can look to 23 and 24, before you're going to see some of these issues completely ironed out. So I would say that's really what's been going on. A lot of smart people are working on trying to find creative solutions to that. One of the things I would also mention, as with any basic economy, if you remember your Econ 101 from college days, it's supply and demand, and it's still very much the case. So you have astronomically high prices for freight, and especially for air freight, but also for sea freight. And the magnitude, the order of magnitude of change is pretty astonishing, where we were paying $1,700 or $2,000 to ship a container from the Asia countries over to the West Coast. Now that same container could cost over $20,000, you know, 22, 25, and then the East Coast also has seen higher prices. So these are things, again, it's going to take a while. I think that once supply starts to come online, you may see those costs start to drop, but it's unlikely that they'll return to the pre-pandemic levels. So certainly shipping costs and lead times may be something that we're going to be living with, longer lead times, higher costs, I would say semi-permanently. So that's our situation. It's really been an interesting challenge.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Duncan. And I will say, when we planned this seminar at AIM, this was several months ago, and we called it Beyond Supply Chains because we were hopeful that we might be moving a little bit beyond supply chain challenges, but clearly that's not happening just yet. Okay, thank you. I'm going to flip now over to Lisa, and kind of in the same vein, you've had a front row seat for the last several years looking at the supply chain challenges because you oversee both airports and, of course, the port. So I'm wondering if you could please characterize the various challenges that you and your port users have faced since the pandemic began, and are all of these still continuing today?
Sure. So thank you, Kristen. And I would say the challenges that Duncan described are quite similar to those faced by our customers in the Port of Boston as well. We have not been immune to the disruptions that are plaguing the global supply chain. And some of that disruption is marked by the higher costs that Duncan referenced, longer lead times, and just a lot of continued uncertainty. And I think the fact that he mentioned it's going to take a few years to work through all this is absolutely true. Global supply chains are complex. The problems are multifaceted. There is no single bullet that is going to fix all of these problems. And I think the recognition that some short-term solutions are really hard to implement. And any proposed changes, I think, have to be carefully considered about how they're integrated throughout the supply chain. There have been a lot of interesting ideas out there, but sometimes you have to worry about unintended consequences. So that's what makes this such a challenging problem that is going to take multiple years to fix. I think I always like to look for silver linings. And so while I had really hoped we would not be talking about supply chain disruptions and issues in April of 2022, I think one of the things that we think is a silver lining is people now have a better understanding and appreciation of where they get the stuff they use every day, right? I think most people had no idea how that pair of sneakers got on their feet, how the wine that they were drinking at night on their table, how it ever arrived. And now that there are shortages, that they go to stores and see empty shelves, and because there's so much attention in the news about this, people have a greater understanding, which I think is beneficial for the industry overall on a whole bunch of fronts. And then the other thing that I noted, Kristen, when you said one of the themes to emerge from the survey that AIM conducts was this idea of being patient. Obviously, we're all working hard to try to find solutions, and we think, regional ports, which we can talk about, can play a part of that solution. But I think this concept of being patient is really, really important in many aspects of today's life, and particularly when it comes to supply chains.
Thank you. That's not something that many Americans are good at, or people in the world are good at, is being patient. But I thought that was a useful lesson, so I'm glad you mentioned that. Okay, now I'm going to flip over to Eric. So given all this that's going on, companies do need financial support and help to do importing and exporting. So I'm wondering what you're seeing among your clients. Are they able to get the financing they need? Are there any particular pitfalls or glitches or positive things that are happening now with financing for companies that are doing international trade?
Sure. Thanks so much, Kristen, and I really appreciate being part of this panel today. But to that question, I mean, the liquidity is still in the market. Banks are eager to obtain, new clients, to lend money, to develop, holistic customer relationships. So we're not really seeing any impediments there. Clients will, especially if they're importing or exporting, and with some of the issues with supply chain, are looking, I think, more closely on how they're managing their payments and their receivables. How can they stretch out their payables? How can they get paid sooner on what goods that they're selling? So when they talk to their banks, it's important that these things are recognized, that the client bring those up, because I mean, there are specialized programs just around trade and to manage trade payments and receivables. And we talk about working capital solutions, which is in the name of my business line. And when you talk to clients about that, they're like, "Oh, I have a working capital line of credit," and that's great. I mean, it helps you kind of finance your day-to-day needs. But how can you further optimize that? How can you further say, okay, it's one thing if I'm just kind of borrowing here and there, but how can I really take payables that I have to large entities or receivables, and just kind of manage that a little bit better, or maybe in kind of an off balance sheet situation where it can provide for a little bit more less expensive financing, because let's face it, the interest rates are going up, so there are going to be some concerns in the market about that. But that's just kind of the nature of the beast in the economy that we're in. But I don't think there's anything to inhibit companies from talking to their banks, and the banks, of course, are going to stick to their the credit profiles of their clients. The banks have to manage their risk, and obviously not every product or every company can get the financing, but we want to take, or every bank is going to take a close look at that, and they want to do business and help companies succeed.
Great. Well, thank you for that. I have a follow-up question for you. So are there any noticeable changes over the past few years that you've seen in terms of the type of financing that your companies are seeking? Is it more of one product, less of another? Is there interest in new or developing products? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And that's a really good question. I mean, as you noted earlier, Kristen, I've been in international trade banking for quite a long time. And when I first started, it was always more about kind of risk mitigation and exporting, and how do I make sure I'm going to get paid, or offer payment assurity to my customers overseas. And while that's still an important aspect of doing business globally, within the trade banking world, we've kind of adopted more of these kind of a different product set around, as I said earlier, working capital solutions. So we're seeing more demands for supply chain financing, where buyers again can have the ability to extend payables to their vendors and offer them cheaper financing to get paid earlier than may exist under their typical line of credit. And then on the other side, for receivable discounting, receivable purchasing, you can go by a couple of different names depending upon the structure, is giving clients the ability to get paid earlier from some very large customers, where the banks look at the credit risk of who they're selling to. It can be on a one company basis. It can be on a multiple company basis, where we look at kind of a pool of what the company's business is. So it's kind of exciting to see that evolution, to be able to where traditionally it was managing the foreign receivables and the foreign payments. While that's still applicable in supply chain and receivables, it also brings in a domestic aspect as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to be restricted to global. It's really just kind of a whole holistic look at the client's working capital portfolio.
Great, that's helpful. And I think it also echoes what we heard in the survey last month from these companies talking about the importance of relationships. So building, strengthening those relationships so that in difficult times, you have those to fall back on, as opposed to waiting until you're in a difficult time and saying, oh, I really need to build those relationships. So that echoes that. Thank you. I'm going to flip back over to Duncan. What different ways of doing supply chain has New Balance put in place over the last few years? And are these likely to be sustained over the next 5-10 years? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there are a lot of changes that the company has made. One of the things that we're very proud of course, is we do have domestic manufacturing. And in this environment, of course, it's been great to draw on the strength of those US factories. And our demand for US made product has really gone up. And I think it's fair to say that normally some of that is a niche product. It tends to be a little bit more costly than the overseas product typically. However, in this environment with freight costs going so high, it's been great to have that. So we just opened a new factory in Methuen, Massachusetts. We're very proud of that, and we're excited about what we can do. So I think that's just an example of how we're kind of doubling down on our made strategy. So that's one important thing. And then beyond that, if you look at our international networks, really, a lot of it has to do with digitalization and trying to improve our information and our networking so we understand at any given time deep into the supply chain where our products are, but also beyond that, where is our capacity. And on the logistics side, we can track our products, but we're also going upstream and looking at what we call tier 2, which is the material and components of our products. So by utilizing better digital strategies, we can remove waste from the system, kind of the end-to-end process. And if you're looking at a customer downstream and you're saying, what do they need, when do they need it, we can cut out a lot of the waste by understanding much more deeply in the supply chain where our products are, where they're coming from, and how to take advantage. So that's been a big push, and it's been fortunate for us that we were able to, we actually started that work before the pandemic, and again, it was very timely because we're right in the middle of a transformation that's giving us immediate benefits. The other thing on supply chain, it is important, obviously, to have a diversified supply chain. That's always been a core part of our strategy. I think that the impact that we had that hit certain countries pretty hard just kind of underscored the importance of not being over-dependent on one area. So before, for example, we might have said within a large country, this is not unprecedented, a pandemic. I lived in Hong Kong during the SARS epidemic, around just after 2000. And so we had to ask that what if question starting back then, saying, well, what if a pandemic hits a major source country? And our approach, to a certain extent, we were looking regionally, and we were saying, well, if you look at Vietnam, for example, it's a very big country, it's a long country, and we were saying, well, if we have some of our supply in the north and some in the south, it's unlikely that both areas will be hit. Well, guess what? Both areas will hit. So I think, we're starting to think about how we manage our risk and maybe diversify it a little bit more. I think also, by the way, it's not just what New Balance or the industry is doing, but we're also seeing countries and governments take a different attitude. So early in the pandemic, we were also quite engaged with both the US government and also some of the international trade associations and governments to try to make sure that we had access to vaccines, because in some cases, some of these countries where we do business had much less access to vaccines than, say, the US, but it really affects US job and US supply chain. It has an impact here too. So there were some cases where it wasn't so much a matter of making more or taking away from one area as reprioritizing product that was already, or vaccines that were already moving. So we've been active in that. And I would say, again, for me, that's a little different. I don't usually get involved in sort of geopolitical issues, but certainly using the trade associations, and I'm sure that's true for many other industries too, we're able to quickly respond to a crisis and sometimes get things moving again.
Thank you. Actually, Duncan, you jumped right into my second question for you, which was about diversifying sourcing. And
I wasn't cheating. I wasn't jumping ahead.
No, I know. I didn't know what the order was going to be, so I understand. Can you just follow up quickly on how you've diversified the countries with which you're doing business? You mentioned Vietnam. Can you talk about some of the others? Yeah.
Sure. So in my business, really, primarily we're making apparel, branded athletic apparel and footwear, and those are, by definition, those are somewhat specialized areas. Not every, I would say every country has an apparel industry, but not every country can make branded athletic products because of the supply chain needs and the special materials and components and processing capabilities that are needed there. And that's even more so in branded athletic footwear, where there really is quite a lot of technical know-how that goes into making those products and feeding those supply chains. So as a result, the industry is quite heavily concentrated in a few countries today. We are looking for ways to diversify a little bit, but for various reasons, the industry really has grown a lot. I've been in the industry over 30 years, and it started out as low-cost countries in making labor-intensive products and shipping those to the big developed markets of Europe and the US. Now what we're seeing is the industry itself has grown much, much bigger than it was before. And that's kind of created a lot of sub-industries and infrastructure that are very important for supporting that. So Asia has become very important, and it's really interconnected with the manufacturing countries and then some of the specialized, more technical countries like Taiwan and Korea. So I think, again, that's kind of probably true for other industries. What we are trying to do is make sure, again, that we're not overly dependent on one country, but you know, if you look, our labor cost is still an important component in what we do, but also scale is very important in what we do. We're not in the lowest cost countries in the world in terms of labor. So if you want to look to Africa, if you want to look to some other parts of Southeast Asia, there are less expensive places to manufacture. But what's become important, again, is the know-how for our machinery and techniques. So that's really making it difficult to diversify too much. But we are actually adding on some additional countries. We do produce now a little bit in terms of close to Europe. We are in Turkey. We are also producing in Brazil, maybe a little bit in Argentina. We produce in India. So there's a little bit of diversity. By the way, we also own and operate our own factory in the UK, and we've been doing that for many years too.
Thank you. Great. Okay, I'm going to follow up on this with you, Lisa. So the port obviously plays a very important role in global trade for all of New England. So can you give a brief summary of the product imports and exports going through the port, and which countries are the primary sources and destinations, and how that might change given some of the investments that you've made recently in the port?
Sure. So we are New England's HomePort. Our strategy is to serve importers and exporters in the region. And so the types of products that come into the Port of Boston through Conley Terminal, furniture, spirits, seafood, sports equipment, office equipment, toys, those are the kinds of things that come in, brought into the port by companies like Jordan's Furniture, BJ's Wholesale, Ruby Wines. And those products are coming predominantly from China. Historically, more than 50% of the imports have come from China, but also Germany, Italy, and increasingly Vietnam. On the export side of the business, some of the products that move out of the Port of Boston include wood products, recycled fibers, scrap metals, and also seafood. Our biggest exporter is International Forest Products, the Kraft family business. And the destination markets for those kinds of products have been China, India, as well as Vietnam. And so, you know, one of the things our customers have said to us for many years, and we've been working on for many years, is they want a direct route, a direct connectivity between Southeast Asia and the Port of Boston. So we have had service from North China that comes to Boston via the Panama Canal operated by the Ocean Alliance. We also have service from North Europe with our longest shipping company partner, Mediterranean Shipping Company. And so we have been working now for many years, even pre-pandemic, not only to make the investments in the port that are required to keep us competitive, but also to do the business development and marketing to attract those new routes. And so we are thrilled that we actually will now have direct connectivity to Southeast Asia. So MSC has modified their European service. They're still going to call a couple of key North European ports, but they've modified the service. They'll still call some Southern European ports, and they are adding direct connectivity to the Indian subcontinent. And then we just landed another service with Zim Lines. That's an Israeli shipping company, has not done business in the Port of Boston before, and they are going to provide connectivity to Vietnam. So we're very excited, and we think the importer and exporter community will be excited about this too, because they've been asking to get this for quite a while. And I think it's consistent with what Duncan described in terms of the diversification strategy that many are pursuing.
And Lisa, when do those new shipping routes take effect? When will they be in place?
Within the next month.
Wow. Okay, that's great news. I can see Duncan nodding. He's happy about that.
Yeah, Lisa's going to get some of her New Balance running shoes through her own port direct from Vietnam now. So
We're super excited about that.
Yeah, that's
yeah,
great news. Good. Okay, I'm going to follow up, Lisa, also about China, because of course we read a lot, we hear a lot about China, and particularly right now about the port closures. Do you see China, which is obviously a big part of what you do at the port, both in terms of imports or exports, do you think that business is likely to grow, or do you think there will be growth among the Southeast Asian countries, some of which you just mentioned because of your new service to Vietnam? Is the pie going to get bigger, or will there be a change in the balance? And you may not know, but wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, there's room for our pie to grow, right? Our strategy is to be a regional port. We are not trying to compete for cargo that is destined for the middle of the country. Our strategy is really to be a full service port for New England's importers and exporters, which means we service generally the New England region. And right now we capture about 40% of the inbound and outbound cargo. So there is a lot of room to grow our market share. If it doesn't move through the Port of Boston, primarily it's coming through the Port of New York and New Jersey. And we can talk about why we think it's much more effective to utilize the Port of Boston and why we think we have a competitive value proposition. And certainly it's more environmentally friendly, right, to bring that cargo in via an all-water service into Boston if it's bound for New England, rather than bringing it in through the Port of New York and New Jersey and trucking it up the busy I-95 corridor. So I do think there is room for us to grow the quote pie, our market share of the New England inbound and outbound cargo. So certainly that means we may get more cargo from China as well. I don't see China going away. When we talk to customers, even those that have had a diversification strategy in place for many years, it is still hard to completely move away from China. But I do expect now with the addition of these Southeast Asian services, we're going to see a bigger proportion of the volume that moves through Conley coming from Southeast Asia. And I still expect the European imports to be pretty strong as well.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to go to Eric in a minute, but I want Duncan to comment on China, because again, China very much in the news, people very interested and aware of it. Can you talk about how New Balance is doing business in or with China? I think that would be of interest.
So I think over the past, kind of 10, 12 years that I've been with New Balance, we've seen a decline in the number of items that we are exporting from China to the rest of the world. But we've also seen the domestic market growing. So we've been able to produce more in China for China. So I think you're starting to see that. I think the elephant in the room there is the geopolitical situation with China and what may happen there, particularly with the war in Ukraine, where you've seen an example of a country, invading another country, and then there have been a lot of sanctions. So people naturally also took a look at the situation in China. And again, it's a really delicate topic, but people are talking openly about the fact China has a stated goal to say that they look at Taiwan as a renegade province, and they have said that they might go back in. So I think people, because of the war in Ukraine, people are starting to ask that question and say, could that happen? And again, I do not want to get into the politics of that whatsoever. I'm not going to have an opinion. I've lived in both countries, by the way. I've lived both in Taiwan and China. So I have my ideas on that. But I think personally, as I look at that, I do think people are sort of looking at the way the situation is developing, and they may be a little bit more cautious about China. So they may start to say, I don't know whether we want to have the degree of dependence that we have. And again, to be transparent about ours, we had formerly, I think the highest share of our foreign-made product many years ago was probably 75% was made in China. Today, it's probably less than 15%. So it's a much smaller number, but other industries are not as far along in that evolution.
Okay, thank you for that. I noticed Eric nodding. I don't know if he was smiling or grimacing, but when you both mentioned the word uncertainty, I'm sure alarm bells were going off in the minds of the bankers who are on the call and also on the panel. So Eric, we wanted to talk with you a little bit about costs. We hear about the increasing costs. We've covered that already in the panel today. And there's a number of reasons that costs are going up for manufacturers. So, raw materials cost more, they're more scarce. There's a lack of inventory, there are delays, there's inflation. So wondering how you and the companies you're working with are managing through these challenges, particularly the cost increases. Are companies passing the costs on to their customers? Are they eating the costs? Is it both of those things? And how do you see that playing out over the next couple of years? Kind of a big question.
So I mean, the way we're kind of looking at this as, some of our customers, like anybody else, you want to do all you can do to not pass costs along to your customers. So we see situations where they're trying to avoid it as much as they can. The predicament around, shipping costs has kind of caused a little bit of an issue where maybe in the past companies could be billed for their shipping costs. Now there's more kind of prepayments that are required, and to cover, any maybe possible payment defaults, companies are asked to be, putting up performance LCs or performance bonds for that. But I think it's just a mix. After a while, it has to be sustainable, where the companies are going to, have to look at the situation and see where it does make sense, that they're going to have to pass some of those costs, along to their clients. And then I also think it speaks to, a little bit what Scott said, is a diversification of where you're doing business. For China, we always talk about China, the kind of the ultimate, place to doing business in China. It's all you've ever heard about. But a lot of these, issues started pre-pandemic with the tariffs that were implemented. That's when I really started to see, people, all of a sudden people had an interest in trade and were recognizing the importance of it because they weren't able to buy product or sell certain product. So they needed new markets to go into. And I think with a new term, but maybe not necessarily a new term, but what you'll start to hear more of is near sourcing. How do I get product from countries that are closer to me at less cost? And of course, these are countries that maybe you haven't done business with before. There's certain risks involved. There's certain payment requirements involved. Like a country, let's say like Pakistan, will not, deal, let's say, on cash payments. There has to be some kind of paper trail, like a letter of credit or collections. So it brought up, a lot of discussion on how to do business a little bit differently and be able to get, product. We talk about this kind of, real time, but companies that need to start stocking the inventory, keep it there so it's available. But again, opening up these new markets where, you can't always rely on one for a variety of reasons. We had tariffs, which, okay, that's everything's politically driven, no matter how you look at it. But I think just for companies, they have to just be prepared. How can they control their costs by maybe just, again, diversifying their resources? And that's where any banker can step in and working directly with freight forwarders and customs, to kind of help manage the whole the payment and the logistics process.
Are you seeing among the companies you work with more moves towards nearshoring or reshoring? Because we hear about it, and actually I'm going to ask the other panelists about this too. You hear about it a lot, but whether it's actually happening or likely to happen, and is it a reasonable next step for a number of companies? So just wondering, Eric, are you seeing that yet, or do you think you're going to start seeing it, or do you know?
No, I have definitely been seeing it. I've been seeing companies doing quite a bit more business with South Asia. So if you want to define that, India, of course, but Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So I definitely saw a greater amount of business going in there over the last couple of years. Different, and not talking about Scott sneakers, but even different articles of clothing, and see more stuff, made in these countries or going to these countries. And what it's also doing, I think there's kind of a benefit to it as well, as it brings these poor countries, more into the globalization, so they can reap some of these benefits that have normally, been given, to the more wealthy countries. So there's been a definite movement towards, trying to do business, in these countries. And what you saw earlier on too, and because Vietnam had come up, even pre-pandemic, pre-tariffs, there was a shift starting to see a shift from China to Vietnam. as well, is to get good quality product at a little bit of a lower cost. So we started to see more business develop there as well, which again just kind of comes up to clients say, okay, now I'm moving my markets. I'm used to dealing with this entity for many years. How do I manage my risk? How do I manage my payments? So it's been probably one of the more interesting times to be in trade in my whole career. Probably I'd say the last 5 years or so, where it's relevant and it's become more of a household discussion, to be quite honest.
Well, thank you, Eric. I'm glad you brought up tariffs because that the major tariffs really came about in the last 4 or 5 years. And at the time, there was a lot of alarm and concern raised. But what I find and hear from others interesting is eventually over time, companies absorb the tariffs, figure out how to manage through them or around them. In a lot of cases, companies don't like tariffs, but there is a reality of managing through challenges and issues. And I think that's what we're seeing a bit of in the supply chain situation as well. Like you as a company figure out a way to manage through, around, whatever, and deal with whatever is thrown at you, expected or unexpected. And I think that also gets back to the whole relationship thing that is so important. I want to continue on this nearshoring, reshoring, whatever topic. Duncan, wondering if you could weigh in on that. Are you seeing that? So let us know what you think about that.
Yeah, so I mean, again, obviously we do have production in key markets or near key markets. So the big three manufacturers for branded athletic footwear globally are certainly China, Vietnam, and Indonesia, and the vast majority of shoes made for export by, I would say, all major brands are coming out of those three countries. So that's an example of a highly concentrated supply chain. However, there have been companies that are doing some onshoring or nearshoring of their products. But at the moment, that is a relatively small subset of the overall. And the easiest explanation for that is scale really matters in this business, but also the rate at which we make technical innovations and the rate at which the manufacturing process evolves and changes is very rapid. And that happens faster in an environment where you have huge scale. And if you have huge scale, you're making changes every day, you're making adjustments, and you're making breakthroughs and finding new ways to do things. It just naturally happens at a very rapid rate. So if you try to replicate the manufacturing process that you have today, that you see in these major manufacturing countries locally, you can compete for a little while, but then usually what happens is the industry will take a left turn and go in a new direction, and it's hard to try to have the scale that justifies the investment. They're pretty massive investments. That's a little bit less true in apparel, and that's why you see more apparel being onshored or nearshored, particularly in Central America for the US, or Turkey and Egypt and Africa for Europe. So I think you're going to see some of that. But again, it's a little bit industry specific. The other thing is that the industries that are importing a lot of products from Asia started, again, it started as a very simple model where you had large developed economies looking for lower cost goods and taking advantage of lower cost labor in Asia. At the moment, that dynamic is really shifting, because you're seeing, if you look at the disposable income dollars and you look at a country the size of China or the size of India, what's happening is that rising middle class is coming into play. They have more and more purchasing power. As a matter of fact, it's actually going to kind of dwarf what you're seeing today in Europe and the US. So a lot of times when we talk about onshoring or nearshoring, there's an assumption that why not manufacture in the markets where we have the scale? And the irony of that is that the scale is now really shifting to these other countries, and they have a labor cost advantage. So what it means is not only can they produce for their very large local markets, but they can export, and they can do that competitively. So when we put tariffs in place, we can even the playing field against maybe countries that are not competing in a fair way, and that helps us when we're importing, so we have parity. But if we then try to export to those countries or to other countries, we don't have that advantage anymore. So it makes it difficult, again, to scale. So one thing I think with the logistics crisis, because the logistics is getting longer and more expensive and it takes more time, products that are really time sensitive, so in particularly fashion products where you really want to respond and get close to the market, I think you can effectively onshore or nearshore that. And it's probably, I would estimate maybe between 10 and 15% of our market. But again, it doesn't matter. You could be doing furniture or light fixtures or other things, and there's a certain fashion element or trend element that you want to be on top with. So I think even at slightly higher manufacturing costs locally in the developed economies of the US and Europe, there is room for that. And I don't think it's fully exploited. So I think you'll see some growth there, but it might be within that 10 to 15% bandwidth. And then beyond that, you're probably still going to see the major manufacturing centers, broadly Asia, if you will, continue to be the big production engines for the majority of the world.
Okay, thank you. We're going to go to Q&A in just a minute, and I do see we're getting some questions in, so I would encourage everyone on the call, if you have a question, please type it into the question pane. Lisa, I want to flip back to you. You had talked about the role of the port, now, and obviously that's related to everything we've talked about here, but particularly the role that regional ports play in the overall supply chain situation globally. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
We think that globally, many of the gateway ports in the US are going to continue to be major gateways. But we think a part of the solution to some of the supply chain disruption we've seen is a greater utilization and reliance on regional ports, right? So LA Long Beach, New York, New Jersey, Savannah, they're always going to be critical gateways. However, ports like Boston that serve regional markets really have a role to play here. And why is that? So we offer efficiency, flexibility, reliability at a congestion-free terminal, right? The major gateways have a hard time offering that kind of value proposition. In addition, because we're an owner-operator, most ports in this country are landlord ports. Port of Boston is not. We own and operate Conley Terminal. We have a very strong relationship with the ILA, with labor. They've increased productivity substantially over the past 5 to 7 years. And trucks can get in and out of our port within 30 minutes. So those are all of the things that we can offer that we think, as people start to think about how do we reimagine our supply chains, what are the ports that we rely on to bring goods into the country or export those goods? I think regional ports have a critical role to play. And many of us have been making significant investments to upgrade our infrastructure in order to support our importers and exporters and the ocean carriers that call. And so, even when you think about it at the Washington level, with a ton of infrastructure money flowing, I think trying to ensure that some of those dollars do flow to alternative gateways is going to be critically important if we're going to think about how do we spread this out? How do we alleviate some of the congestion in those major gateways, enable them to do what they do best, but also enable these other port properties who are significant economic engines for their states and their regions to do what they do best and what we do best.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to go to questions now. We've got a couple lined up. One is, this is for Duncan. I'm looking at my phone. This is how it came in. Has New Balance had to hold more inventory to account for bottlenecks in the supply chain?
I'm just laughing because that's the story of my life right now, is trying to get more product moved quickly. I think the quick answer to that is we've been trying to get more inventory, but we've been on the other side of that curve. We saw demand shut down. We saw orders slow down to the factories. Then we saw the factories not being able to produce. So that resulted in a situation where we couldn't get quite as much inventory as we wanted. We now have vast amounts of product flowing in. So that is going to restore the inventory levels. We're certainly hoping that we don't have to hold it. It's been moving through pretty quickly. So we hope that we're going to continue to see that trend in our business. But again, it's a little bit hard to say if all the things we were talking about with inflation and things. So let's see how the economy is. But suffice to say that we have not held a lot more inventory when it comes to finished products. Now, the other piece of that on the supply side, we have had to hold more inventory of materials in order to take some of the volatility out of the deliveries. So typically it takes us about 30 days between the time we order materials and components to the time we get them into our factories from all over the world into our factories. And we certainly been driving those numbers up and holding, more like 45 or 60 days of inventory when we can get it.
Okay, I'm going to follow up on that. Oh, yeah, we've got questions coming in. Okay, good problem to have here. I want to talk a little bit about lean, and I know, Eric, you and I talked about this a little bit yesterday. Are we seeing companies carrying more lean, moving more to carrying more than they might think they need? So question for Eric, for starters, and anybody else who wants to weigh in. So Eric.
Yeah, I mean, I think in order to, kind of mitigate the risks of not being able to obtain inventory and have these problems, we're going to see more kind of a, warehousing or buildup of inventory for certain companies. Yeah, again, as Scott alluded to, every segment in every industry is different. But I'm pretty confident from what I've seen that there is a buildup, and they just want to make sure that they have it available and on hand. And there are, again, kind of going back to when you talk about these different financing structures, and one of the things that's kind of becoming a little bit more relevant is inventory financing, specifically around that, to be able to procure, to hold them. It's kind of a little bit of a complex structure to get in here now, but it shows how the markets and the financial industries, again, are evolving to kind of meet these needs as we see them, come up, that because there's challenges we really haven't seen before. You got this kind of vortex of everything happening at once between the pandemic and then supply chain and tariffs and other political situations. So we've always got to kind of think ahead and have a contingency plan to manage that. So I would think you're going to see a little bit more stocking of inventory, and again, a little bit segment specific.
Well, and I think what's interesting about what you just mentioned, Eric, is that you said there are new products. There's new demand for new kinds of products for financing, and I think that's an important point to share with our viewers. That talk with your banker, your financial institution, because there may be products that you haven't considered or that maybe didn't even exist in the way that they do. If you look
exactly, yeah. And it may not be kind of new, but it's kind of, again, just being, okay, now there's more of a demand to do something and get a little bit kind of more creative. That goes beyond your just traditional revolving line of credit.
Yep, good. Okay, more questions. Whew, catching my breath here. Okay, we talked about this a little bit, but what is the risk of a major change in Chinese relations because of Ukraine and Hong Kong? Duncan, you touched on this. Again, I don't think we want to veer too much into the political here. That might be a different topic for a different trade talk, and we're going to be doing a few more of those. With the breaking news that's happening, one never knows. But I'm wondering if anybody wants to kind of weigh in on that. Duncan, do you want to elaborate a little bit on what you already mentioned, or not?
I mean, I think I mentioned the risks. I think there are known risks out there that people are thinking about, and they're thinking about them in a little bit of a different way now that we had that situation with Ukraine. But whether that translates to action or not, I'm not sure. But I do think that people are certainly thinking about that situation and understanding it. It is very important that we have plans and contingencies in case sort of some of these events play out the way we think they might. So.
Okay. We're getting another question here. This is about nearshoring and actually related to North America. And actually, this has come up before our session today. But do we think there's a likelihood of more production, not just necessarily in the US, but in Canada or particularly Mexico? Because I know there was talk a few years ago, actually, when the tariffs were first announced, will this mean that there will be more because of the US MCA, the new NAFTA? This will make Mexico, for instance, a more attractive destination for some production. So I don't know, Lisa, if you have any thoughts on that? No? Yes?
I would suggest that probably Duncan and Eric are closer to decisions about whether you move manufacturing source from those two countries. So I will defer to their expertise.
Okay, so you guys, you need to give a quick answer and then we're going to go to the lightning round.
Well, I mean, I know there's been a push from the current administration to obviously bring more manufacturing back to the United States.
Yes, yes.
Businesses will look at that as a bit impractical because of the costs associated with it. But tied into that, there's a lot of kind of beneficial programs out there for exporters as well. I mean, you can talk about Exim Bank. They're kind of revamping a little bit and looking things a little bit differently, especially with China competition, that they're developing programs around that. Is there's a specific exporter and an exporter in a specific industry, have product where there's tight China competition, and could that qualify, for some specialized financing? We could help offset, some of the costs of bringing the manufacturing back here. I mean, I think we'd all like to see more made in America stuff, and we want to see the U.S. export as much as possible. And we're all here to help make that happen. Get it out of Lisa's ports, have Scott manufacture it. But there are some impracticalities to that and costs. But but I think it's something that we also have to consider. It's all just part of that contingency. It's like, is it better to know that we can have it, make it, and make it right versus not being able to obtain it? Because look, we all have to expect the unexpected anymore, I think. So the way we do things.
Yeah, and I think certainly during COVID, we saw a lot of companies, not just in Massachusetts, but across the US, really stepping up to produce PPE on very short notice.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep. We did
Proving it can be done. I know New Balance was involved. We had a number of AIM member companies that were involved in that effort. So, there are certainly very good reasons to have certain items available in the US in cases of crisis, which we certainly were in. So
yeah, and you have to be careful of it because there's more risk. I mean, what we saw, you bring up an example, Kristen, just real quickly, with PPE, everybody was out there trying to get the gloves and the masks. And what we saw more often than not were just these nefarious actors who, I can get you all of this for this price. And it was like, there were like 4 people in the supply chain. And at the end of the day, it was like a non-existent factory or something like that. So again, that's another thing to consider, is that when something becomes needed so suddenly, there could be, a risk in obtaining that and not have existing products. So I think it has to be more prepared that we can have these and ready to go.
Agree. Okay.
Listen, if I can jump in for just one quick second,
and Duncan, you jump in quickly, and then you can start our lightning round. So you give the answer to this, and then you give your 1 minute overall. So go.
Okay, so I was just going to say that when it comes to local manufacturing, and also, it ties into what we're talking about, lean. We have opportunities to manufacture very efficiently and effectively locally a lot of products, a lot more. And the lean question was interesting to me because when we think of lean, people automatically think about time and shortening the amount of inventory that you have. But there are other ways to do it. You can hold the inventory less for less time by basically looking at the way you convert it. So it's called conversion, the conversion of finished goods. If you can defer the conversion, you can get those materials in. Maybe it takes a little longer to get them in, but you use modularity to combine those materials in really different and creative ways and make products that are relevant to the market very quickly. So by essentially, if you think about going to a restaurant, when you go to that restaurant, they have a lot of ingredients in the kitchen. They can make you anything you want very, very quickly. Okay, and they don't have to hold that because all the basics are pretty quick. So if you're talking about being smart about how to manufacture, more or less, that's one way to do it. And I think that there is a lot of scope to do that that's sort of untapped. And I think that is, if we focus on that area, we're really going to be able to do well. If we're going to try to compete with mass production with very long lead times where it's commodity items that are produced at mass scale, that's harder to do. But there's lots of opportunity to do that, and by flexing our muscles in that area and creating that capability, it also will create more diversity in terms of what we're actually able to do. So I think there could be a little bit of a manufacturing renaissance in the U.S. I think there's some possibility there.
Well, that's a very positive note. Thank you for that.
Maybe
All
that's
right.
my summary.
Good. I'm going to have you take us out, Lisa. So some closing thoughts.
Sure. So, we're cautiously optimistic. Certainly there is a lot of uncertainty that remains, and I don't think the supply chain challenges that we're all facing are going to dissipate overnight, but there are a lot of smart, creative people who are thinking about ways to address these challenges over the medium and long term. And so I think we all have a reason to be optimistic. And we see that not only on the port side of the business, but we see that on the air travel side as well. So that would be my closing thoughts, cautious optimism.
That sounds great. All right. Well, we're out of time. Thank you all to the panelists. We really appreciate your taking the time today and sharing your insights. Just a few last minute things. Thank you again to our sponsors, Santander and New Balance. Upcoming for AIM, for those of you who are interested, AIM's annual meeting is a week from Friday, which is May 6th. We hope you will all register for that and attend. And we will be doing future trade talks probably in June and then again in the fall. So we would welcome the opportunity to have you join us for those. As always, if there's anything AIM can do for you or your company, please get in touch with us directly. My email is up on the screen. It's krupert@aimnet.org. Thank you and have a good day.
Take
Bye.
care.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.